On May 18, 2018, a 55-year-old man in Monroe, Washington, tossed a half-empty coffee cup out his window. Seconds later, a detective in an unmarked car swooped in to retrieve it. They didn't care about the cup. They cared about the trace of DNA on the rim. It was the break they'd waited 31 years for. But to understand how a discarded cup in 2018 finally caught a killer, we have to go back to a cold, dark night in November of 1987. One mystery can send shockwaves through generations. If you're committed to uncovering the truth for those who can no longer speak for themselves, subscribe to Ripple Effect Stories. A new case every week, because the truth is always worth the wait. Tanya Van Cuylenborg was 18 years old. She had just graduated high school in Saanich, British Columbia, a quiet town on Vancouver Island where people knew their neighbors and kids grew up without much reason to worry. She was at the exact age where everything feels like it's just beginning. Freshly out of school, figuring out what came next, and experiencing, for the first time, what it felt like to be in love. Her boyfriend was Jay Cook, 20 years old, also from Saanich. They had been together about 6 months. Jay was the only son in his family. His mother, Leona, later said that Tanya was very special to him. Tanya brought her Minolta X700 camera on the trip. That detail matters. She wasn't just going along for a supply run. She wanted to document their first real trip together. The small moments, the stops along the way, the kind of ordinary photographs that only become precious later. The trip had the most ordinary beginning imaginable. Jay's father needed heater parts from a heating supplier in Seattle. Jay volunteered to go pick them up. Simple enough. But somewhere along the way, the two of them turned it into something a little bigger. A night in the Cook family's old van, a ferry crossing. A trip that was theirs. They planned to be back home the next morning. On the evening of November 18, 1987, Jay and Tanya boarded a ferry from Sydney, British Columbia to Port Angeles, then transferred to a second ferry from Bremerton to Seattle. That ferry docked at approximately 11:3 p.m. From that moment, no one knew where they went. No phone calls home. No check-in. When Gensino Heating opened the following morning, no one came to pick up the order. This was not normal behavior. Both Jay and Tanya were described as responsible, reliable people, the kind of young adults who stayed in touch, who didn't just disappear. By the evening of November 19th, when they should have been home since the afternoon, neither the Cook nor the Van Cuylenborg family had heard a word. Both families reported them missing immediately, but Jay and Tanya were no longer in Canada. They were somewhere in Washington state, in a place where neither family had connections, didn't know where to start, and had no leads to follow. They waited, not knowing that the answer, when it finally came, would shatter everything. On November 24th, 6 days after the ferry left Victoria, a passerby on a rural road near Alger in Skagit County, Washington, saw something no one wants to see. Tanya Van Cuylenborg's body was lying in a ditch beside the road, dumped under a steep embankment. She was 18 years old. She had been raped. She had been shot in the back of the head. Her hands were bound behind her back with plastic zip ties. She had been lying there for 6 days. That same day, Tanya's wallet and keys were found discarded near the Greyhound bus station in Bellingham. The Cook family's van was located in a downtown parking lot a few blocks away. Inside the van, investigators found zip ties of the same type used on Tanya, plastic gloves, receipts. The Bremerton-Seattle ferry ticket confirming the couple had made that crossing on November 18th, and they found Tanya's black pants, the ones she had been wearing the night she was killed. That item, those pants, would become the central piece of evidence in the entire case. But no one could know that yet. Tanya's Minolta X700 camera was not in the van. It had disappeared with the killer and was never recovered, and Jay was still missing. 2 days later, on November 26th, Jay Cook's body was found under a high bridge in Snohomish County, nearly 60 miles south of where Tanya had been discovered, near a local correctional facility called the Monroe Honor Farm. Jay had not been shot. The killer had used a completely different method. He had been beaten with a rock, strangled with twine and 2 red dog collars. And in one final act of cruelty, a pack of cigarettes had been stuffed down his throat. Zip ties of the same type used on Tanya were found near his body. 2 victims. 2 locations 60 miles apart. 2 completely different methods of killing. But the same ties. The same deliberate cruelty. The same killer. The crime now spanned 4 separate counties in Washington state. King, Skagit, Whatcom, and Snohomish. The killer had moved across the entire region with purpose, scattering the evidence, scattering the bodies, creating jurisdictional complexity. What he left behind, an unidentified fingerprint on the van, and DNA from semen found on Tanya's black pants. In 1987, DNA had only been used in a criminal investigation for the first time the previous year. The technology existed, but a DNA profile from an unknown person is useless if that person has never left a trace in any database. The most direct evidence of the killer was right there from day one, and there was nothing investigators could do with it. The DNA extracted from Tanya's pants was assigned a label. Individual A. Individual A did not match Jay Cook. Jay was a victim, not a suspect, confirmed the moment his bound and beaten body was found under that bridge. Individual A matched no one in any criminal database. Over the years, more than 200 names crossed the desk of Detective Jim Scharf, the Snohomish County investigator who became synonymous with this case for more than 2 decades. 2 of those names stood out, Robert Yates and Charles Sinclair, both serial killers who had been active in the Seattle area around 1987. Both had attacked women. Both could have been in the region at the right time. Both were thoroughly investigated. DNA ruled them out completely. Every dead end added one more line to a list that kept growing longer. Then came the letters. About 1 month after the murders, the Cook and Van Cuylenborg families began receiving anonymous letters. Threatening, terrifying, written by someone claiming to be the person who had killed Jay and Tanya. The letters arrived from different locations over the years. Police couldn't ignore them. Was this the killer, taunting the families, or someone else, someone exploiting the tragedy for reasons of their own? Investigators chased leads from those letters in parallel with the main investigation for more than 2 decades. It wasn't until 2010, thanks to a tip from viewers of the television show Washington's Most Wanted, that police finally identified the letter writer, a Canadian man in his 70s with severe mental illness. He had heard about the case on the news in 1987 and had been writing the letters for reasons no one fully understood. He had no connection whatsoever to the murders. 23 years of investigative resources had been partially absorbed by a man who had nothing to do with the crime. Individual A remained unknown. By the early 2000s, the case had become one of Washington state's most persistent cold cases, a case where the killer had left clear biological evidence that was completely useless because there was no way to connect it to a person who had never been arrested, never appeared in a criminal database, and was presumably living a normal life somewhere. Jim Scharf looked at that file and said, publicly, "This is probably the most terrible unsolved case we have." He was not related to Jay or Tanya. He had no personal obligation beyond his professional duty. But this case stuck. He became the person most closely attached to it for 23 years, re-interviewing witnesses, following every new development in DNA technology, never truly closing the file in his mind. He understood one thing with certainty. The killer had left DNA. DNA doesn't fade. DNA doesn't forget. The only thing missing was technology powerful enough to use it. And somewhere on Vancouver Island, the Cook and Van Cuylenborg families continued to live inside a question that had no answer. Jay's mother, Leona Cook, was still alive. Still waiting. Eustace shouldn't have an expiration date. If you believe every story deserves to be heard, subscribe to Ripple Effect Stories. New deep dives every week. Don't miss the next one. In 2007, 30 years into the investigation, Jim Scharf made a decision that changed everything. He reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a forensic company in Virginia that had pioneered a technique called DNA phenotyping. The idea, analyze the DNA itself to predict the physical appearance of the person who left it. Skin tone, hair color, eye color, facial bone structure. For the first time in 3 decades, Scharf had something resembling a face to look at instead of just a code in a database. But Parabon offered something else. They introduced Scharf to C.C. Moore, America's leading genetic genealogist, and the newly appointed head of Parabon's genetic genealogy division. Genetic genealogy is not the same as DNA database matching. It doesn't require the suspect to be in any criminal database. Instead, it works through relatives. If any distant family member of the killer has voluntarily uploaded their DNA to a public genealogy website, that connection can be traced. backward through family trees, forward through descendant branches, until only one name is left standing. To do this, Scharf needed a public DNA database. That's where Chelsea Rustad came in. In 2015, Rustad, a woman from Tumwater, Washington, sat down with a consumer DNA test kit she had purchased. She collected a saliva sample and uploaded her results to GED Match, a website where people share DNA to find relatives and build family trees. She had never heard of Jay Cook or Tanya Van Cuylenborg. She had no idea about individual A. She was simply curious about her own roots, the same reason millions of Americans were uploading their DNA during those years. But Rustad shared a distant genetic connection to the killer, and that connection was now in the database. In 2018, Cece Moore uploaded individual A's DNA profile to GED Match and began searching through approximately 1 million profiles. She found two distant relatives of individual A, people who shared enough genetic material to place them on the same branch of the family tree. From those two starting points, Moore built the tree backward. She found the common ancestors. Then she traced every descendant branch downward, eliminating individuals one by one based on gender, age, and geography, until only one name remained. 2 hours. That was all the time Cece Moore needed to do what 31 years of traditional investigation could not accomplish. The name, William Earl Talbot II, the son of William and Patricia Talbot of Monroe, Washington. This couple had one son, William Earl Talbot II, 24 years old in 1987, living approximately 11 kilometers from where Jay Cook's body had been found under that bridge. As Scharf investigated Talbot's background, the pieces fell into alignment. In 1987, Talbot had worked as a delivery driver, running routes through the Seattle area, the same general territory Jay and Tanya were heading into to pick up heater parts. A few months before the murders, he had been fired. In November 1987, he had no fixed schedule, no delivery routes, and nothing anchoring him to any particular place. A former roommate, located and questioned, added more. He had seen a blue blanket in Talbot's home and truck that year, similar to the blanket found on Jay Cook's body. He described Talbot as having a volatile temper, and he remembered that Talbot had once taken him to the exact general area where Jay Cook's body was later discovered. Talbot knew that location, had been there before. But genetic genealogy results, while powerful enough to point to a single name, are not legal evidence. They cannot stand up in court. Scharf needed direct DNA from Talbot himself, obtained legally without alerting him. The solution was surveillance. Scharf and his team followed Talbot for several days. Talbot was still working as a truck driver. They waited, watched, waited some more. Then, at a red light, Talbot's coffee cup fell from his truck. Scharf's team collected it immediately, drove it to the Washington State Patrol lab the same day. Forensic scientist Lisa Collins ran the comparison between the DNA on the cup and individual A's 31-year-old profile. She cried when she read the results. It was a perfect match. The probability of another person on Earth carrying the same profile, 1 in 180 quadrillion. Individual A had a name, William Earl Talbot II. On May 18, 2018, 31 years after Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg stepped onto that ferry, William Earl Talbot II was arrested. He was 55 years old, a middle-aged truck driver, a man no one in the community had associated with this case for 3 decades. At the press conference, Jay's sister described the feeling as a mix of relief, joy, and profound sadness. Jay's mother, Leona, who had waited 31 years, said it simply, "On one hand, we're moving toward closure. On the other hand, I still don't have my only son." Tanya's brother, John Van Cuylenborg, could finally attach a real face and a real name to the absence that had defined his family's life since 1987. Talbot pleaded not guilty. The trial opened in June 2019 in Everett, Washington. And from the first days, it was clear this was not only a murder trial. It was a landmark test of genetic genealogy as a legal tool. The defense attacked the method directly. Whether DNA from an uninvolved third party, Chelsea Rustad, who simply wanted to build a family tree, could be used to identify a suspect. Whether the genetic information of innocent people could be used in a criminal investigation without their knowledge or consent. The court allowed the evidence. A precedent was set. The defense offered an alternative theory, that Talbot and Tanya had consensual sex before someone else killed both of them. The prosecution dismantled it point by point. Tanya was abroad for the first time with her boyfriend, on her period. Both victims were bound with the same type of zip ties. Both were killed. Both bodies were found with physical evidence linking the same perpetrator. There was no second killer. On June 28, 2019, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. In July 2019, the judge sentenced Talbot to 2 consecutive life terms without parole. The case did not end there. In December 2021, the Washington Court of Appeals overturned the conviction, not because of the DNA evidence, not because of genetic genealogy, but because of a juror who had given unclear answers about their own impartiality during jury selection. The families, who had sat in that courtroom and heard the word guilty, had to face the possibility of living through it all again. Then on December 25, 2022, the Washington Supreme Court reinstated the verdict in full. The court's reasoning: Talbot's defense team had the legal right and opportunity to remove that juror during selection. They chose not to. A defendant cannot lose at trial and then appeal something they had the tools to prevent. 2 life sentences. Upheld. Unappealable. The case was closed. Now consider what this case left behind. Not just a conviction. A method that changed how the world hunts for killers. This was the first case in history solved using genetic genealogy. C.C. Moore's approach. Finding distant relatives in public databases, building family trees backward, eliminating until only one name remained, was adopted across the United States after Talbot's arrest. It led directly to the identification and arrest of the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, just weeks after Talbot. California's most prolific serial killer and rapist, whose identity had remained unknown for decades. Dozens of cold cases followed. And then there's the other ripple effect, the one that doesn't have a clean answer. Chelsea Rustad, who uploaded her DNA simply out of curiosity, was later contacted by police and told that her genetic information had been used to identify a murderer in her own family. She had broken no laws. She consented to nothing beyond building her own family tree, but her DNA, and through it, the DNA of every relative connected to her by blood, had become part of a criminal investigation she never knew existed. When you share your DNA, do you share a piece of every person genetically connected to you? Where does genetic privacy begin and end? Who decides what your DNA can be used for? Even when the purpose is to catch a killer. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg case place those questions before the entire world. The legal and ethical debate continues. Jim Scharf, the detective who spent 23 years on this case, said the same thing from the first day he picked up the file until the day Talbot was arrested. This is probably the most terrible unsolved cold case we have. That statement didn't change over 23 years. Only its ending changed. On the evening of November 18, 1987, Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg boarded a ferry from Victoria with a Minolta camera on her shoulder and a simple plan: pick up the heater parts, sleep one night in the van, and drive home in the morning. The photos Tanya planned to take were never taken. The camera disappeared with the killer and was never found. But 31 years later, in a courtroom in Everett, Washington, they were heard. This case is a reminder that time does not protect the guilty. It only delays the reckoning. If this story moved you, subscribe to Ripple Effect Stories. Every week, we uncover the cold cases where one moment changed everything. Before you go, type Tanya and Jay in the comments. Just those 2 names, so they're not forgotten.